voices in the garden. Last week I started this series and I told you there were 3-4 voices in the garden. We had the voice of God in the garden. We had the voice of the devil in the garden. We had the voice of man in the garden. And I told you that the garden is a symbol of man's life. God was the one that planted the garden, and then God placed man in the garden. Now your marriage could be a garden. Your career could be the garden. Your job could be a garden. Your church could be a garden. All of us are different gardens of life. In the beginning, I love to study the beginning. If it's anything like PhD Genesis, I would like to have that. And there's a lot of wisdom that we can get from the beginning of the books. There was a garden and there was a ground. When they missed the mark, God pushed them to the ground. God cursed man, and God took man out of the garden, and God placed man on the ground. Many of us here are walking on grounds, not gardens. You better look at where you're walking. The ground is cursed, the garden is blessed. He said, with your sweat you will water the ground. But the garden was wet by God's dew. That's what the Bible tells us in the scriptures. In the beginning, God was one that wet the garden, planted the garden, and put the trees there. So we see many Christians that labor and work and toil, and they find nothing to show for it. Maybe, just maybe, they are on grounds and not in a garden. Make sure where you are presently located is a garden and not a ground. Ask your neighbor, where do you work? Ask them, say, where do you work? The ground or the garden? The first Adam had 2 places where he worked. He worked in the ground and he worked in the garden. Many Christians don't realize that. When you work in the garden, you labor less. When you work in the garden, God helps you up. When you work in the garden, the angels are there to support you. When you work in the garden, God provides for you. When you work in the garden, provision becomes easier. When you work in the garden, the trees there will be great. However, when you walk on the ground, it's a cursed place. When you walk on the ground, it's your toil and your sweat that will make it. You will have to put in so much effort to get so little back in return. Many people don't know that. I want to walk in a garden. I want to be in the center of God's will in my life. I want to live in a garden. I want to dwell in a garden. I don't want to spend more time on the grounds. There are all kinds of cursed grounds out there. There's a person, and God has informed us and instructed us. Sometimes even we as pastors try to help people that are not in the garden and are in the ground. And because God pushed him out of the garden, he began to labor on the ground. And that was where, unfortunately, he had the first child, Cain, and then Abel as well. Where? On the ground. On the ground. And one of the children he had, Abel, tried to struggle so he could leave the ground and stay in the garden. And that was why Abel sought the Lord's face. Abel wanted to be like the Lord. Abel wanted to love the Lord. And there are voices. There are voices. Many people are unhappy today because they are not in the garden. And they probably do not even realize they have obeyed the voices that are not the voice of God. There are several voices that shout at us, that tell us different kind of things, that gives us instructions in life. We listen to the voice of media more often than not. People just listen to the media. They let the media instruct and tell them and give them directions on what they should do and what they should not do. The media defines and refines our mind for us, unfortunately for most of us. And they forget that there is a voice that is called the voice of God. John's Gospel, the 10th chapter. Most assuredly I say to you, verse 1, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up the other way, the same is a thief and a robber. Bible tells us about a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. Underline his voice. Underline his voice. The sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Second one is what? They know his voice. They know his voice. The first, the sheep hear his voice. Verse number 3, the sheep hear his voice. You know why they hear his voice? Because in verse 4, they know his voice. Hallelujah. They know his voice. Ask your neighbor, do you know the voice of God? Are you serious? I'm honest. Ask your neighbor, do you know the voice of God? Ask and say, neighbor, do you know the voice of God? They know his voice. Jesus is the shepherd of my life. They know his voice. The role of a shepherd is to lead you in life. You follow your shepherd. Every step you've taken the last 10 years, whose instructions did you follow? Whose voice did you listen to? Blowing the voice of God. They know his voice.